There we go. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little about the status quo, the funding, and the regulatory affairs, but I'll start with the broad overview of what we do and how our corporations look like at NOW. From this very Eurocentric map, I would say we start very much in the West, in the United States. And I'll explain a little with whom we're talking to mostly and what we're talking about. So there's a lot of exchange, of course, with our colleagues in California, the California Fuel Cell Partnership, and here it's really a lot about the infrastructure, so a lot about the fuel stations, given that California is also pretty advanced here. With the DOE and their Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office, I mean, there's a lot of exchange on really the R&D projects that we have. So H2 at scale in the US. There are also some bilateral projects, for example, with the national labs, so German lab that receives funding for a certain project, teams up with a national lab like the NREL, for example. Then moving a little to the south, to South America. Here it's mostly in the context of the export initiative. And partly bilateral and multilateral cooperation. The same goes largely for Africa, so there's a lot of potential still for cooperation there. Coming to Europe, I mean, we are, of course, closely really embedded, thank God, in the single market and in the European Union. So from a policy perspective, there's a lot of forums and organizations where we take part. There are, of course, also very close ties to the fuel cell and hydrogen joint undertaking. One of the organizations that's been really in the game the longest in Europe, I would say, together with us. Here we have close ties and are really happy about these. And there are, of course, also loads of bilateral liaisons that we have, for example, with the French, of course, and also, as we've heard today, from a regional perspective, but also from the national federal perspective with the Dutch. Then moving to the east, I'm very happy that he will speak a little about it later himself. Our deep cooperation with Japan and the Japanese New Technology Development Organization, NEDO. Here, I mean, the main projects are, of course, or the main workshops that we do together are also, again, on hydrogen refueling infrastructure, but also power to gas. And, I mean, in the international sphere, there's probably not been, another country that has really singled out hydrogen as a key topic for how to go ahead in the energy system as Japan. So we always learn a lot. With China and the People's Republic of China, there are also quite a few bilateral projects that we do under the umbrella of the SGC. I will go into more detail later on that. So until then, I would say, please take the next slide. Thank you very much. You've probably seen this picture a lot during this conference, the National Hydrogen Strategy. So what does it have to say, the German National Hydrogen Strategy, that is, about international cooperation? Actually divides it up into the European part and the international part. And in the European part, it's kind of flimsy. So it says, we have to make progress on hydrogen-related dossiers. Everybody who really works on the issue in on the European level, of course, knows what is meant. So it's the RED II that is infamous, I would say, and comes up a lot, also as part of the strategy. It's regulations, codes, and standards for any possible application that you can think of. So everything we need in the single market together, and the creation of these important projects of common European interest that were discussed also in the session before. And then it says in measure 33 that what the goal is the establishment of a European hydrogen company. So I think the authors thought a little of Airbus perhaps, but I think what's meant here is really to create, a European value chain of covering the whole hydrogen sector, I would say. Next slide, please. In the international market for H2, so that's the second large part with measures 34 through 38. The goal here is really to make green hydrogen competitive and convert the production and the export of hydrocarbons into perhaps hydrogen or at least renewable hydrocarbons. The measures are manifold, so it starts off with more bilateral energy partnerships and cooperation in the international organizations, pilot projects in the partner countries, and really the focus is also a lot on countries that export right now fossil energies and to perhaps convert these exports into hydrogen exports. Next slide, please. Yes, I've broadly divided this presentation into three main areas. The first one is exchange and best practice. The second one will be on bi- and multilateral projects, and the third one on the regulatory frameworks. But let's start with the exchange and best practices. Next slide, please. Yes, so it's a confusing, albeit not complete overview of the international organizations that are treating hydrogen at the moment. There are probably even some more. If you find this confusing, don't be alarmed. That's kind of the point, because the initiatives are really, there's a myriad of them, I would say. At the bottom, we can start with the IEA and the rather long-standing TCPs, the technology collaboration programs, which are also grounded, I would say, a lot in R&D. Then we move up a little to the mission innovation. Here it's a lot about exchange of the outcomes of and demonstration projects and really international, I would say, policy learning. And then we have actors like IRENA who have set up special forums or special working groups on hydrogen. And then there's, of course, also the IPHE, which is really an organization that has been dedicated to hydrogen for more than a decade now. IPHE stands for International Partnership of Hydrogen in the Economy. And here the scope is a little more than just exchange, I would say. So it's really also about policy development, things like global sustainability criteria, but also regulations, codes, and standards on a common level are part of this. And then really on a high echelon, there's also on a high level, there's the Clean Energy Ministerial and part of it, the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial. We shall see whether there's some consolidation and it becomes clearer where, which parts of the hydrogen sphere in the international business will be set out. But until then, I would go to the next slide, please, to give you a little more in detail, a little more of an in-detail perspective of one of these initiatives, and that's the mission innovation. So here Germany has been in the lead, and that means NLW has been in the lead together with the European Commission, represented for a large part by the FCHJU. And it's really about the bringing together the national demonstration projects at large scales. In Germany, that would be Highland and the regulatory sandboxes. On the European level, the H2 valleys, and soon the IPSIs, and really enable learning and exchange about how these projects go, and therefore really a platform has been set up. And it's actually just been a week since that has happened, but there's more to come. The Mission Innovation is going to continue. This was Innovation Challenge 8, but the Mission Innovation Challenge on hydrogen is definitely going to continue, and we are going to be part of the story. Next slide, please. yes, like I said, bi- and multilateral projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, I would start, just because we don't have a representative really here today in person, with the Sino-German Electromobility Innovation and Support Center. So, because it's a good example of how these bilateral cooperations can be set up. So, on the strategic level, we have the two ministries. So, the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure from Germany, and the Ministry of Science and Technology from the People's Republic of China. Then underneath come the implementing bodies, if you will. So the management, that's done by us, by LW, and CATARC, which is the Center for Automotive Research in China. And we have defined 4 different research areas. And 3 of them have directly something to do with hydrogen. And in these research areas, there are representatives who cover these research areas and establish a monitoring platform, but also projects in the scope of these research areas are being undertaken, and we'll hear more of that later on by Mr. Reinhold Wurster. Next slide, please. Then the next big buzzword, something that's rather look into the future, is the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance. This really has a lot to do with the IPCEI or IPCEI development, so this development of projects, important projects of common European interest. Just a brief reminder, so these IPCEIs are projects where you basically, as a member state, can diverge a little from the state aid rules. So you can apply higher funding rates for certain projects, and these might go up to 100%, which will probably never be the case, but anyway. There are 6 so-called CEO roundtables, and it's our pleasure, and we are full of pride that we are in one of these, which is the Clean Hydrogen for Mobility Roundtable. So we are not only part of the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, but also of the CEO roundtables, and are really very keen for it to set off next week. What's the role of these hydrogen roundtables? So the role really at a high level, at the CEO level, is really to build a pipeline of scale-up projects, and that those are these IPCEI projects, and to really flesh out a investment agenda in the area. So we can come to really a European value chain for hydrogen and related products. Next slide, please. Last few words on the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. So I've tried to map out just a brief snippet of the regulatory landscape covering hydrogen. A keen observer might object that the ETS is missing. So yeah, the ETS is actually missing here. But that is because I've really focused on those sectors where we have done the most work in the past for. So they are the vehicle manufacturers. I've always put the legislative acts and whom they address mostly, not exclusively, on this slide. So they're the vehicle manufacturers with the CO2 emission standards, the fuel suppliers with the RED II, the Renewable Energy Directive, or the recast Renewable Energy Directive in this case. The alternative fuels infrastructure, which obliges member states to set goals, even though hydrogen, as of now, is still optional. And then, of course, the rules for DSOs, TSOs, and utilities in the gas market and the internal electricity market, or the internal market for electricity. This has been, like I said, it's not exclusive, but this has been a lot of our work looking at these regulations and seeing how we can make this the single market for hydrogen work. Next slide, please. This is really what the European Commission has in store for us for the next year. So in 2019, or at the end of 2019, they started with the Green Deal, which was the basic plan of how to convert the European economy in the end, the European economy into a climate neutral one. That was followed in 2020 by a myriad of strategies. So, of course, there's European hydrogen strategy, which was published on the same day in July as the strategy for the energy system integration. And then late last year in December, we've seen the ascendance of the sustainable and smart mobility strategy. So, wow, a lot of strategies. What's the actual outcome of these? These are the legislative proposals that you can see in the largest arrow. And this is what we'll have to do, or the wave of legislative proposals that comes rolling onto the member states and the parliament, of course, in 2021. And you can see that there's the revision of the ETS to include maritime shipping, especially, then the effort sharing regulation, which covers all the sectors outside of the ETS, and then what's a little more concrete and I would say concerns hydrogen a little more are the RED II, the CO2 emission performance standards for cars and vans and lorries, and for the first time also for buses. So with the RED II and most of the existent emission performance standards, we can just expect the ambition to go up. But that also means we need a lot of hydrogen applications very soon. I will not go through the rest of this. This is really just very much a European perspective. I think on a global perspective, what's really missing the most right now, also if we look at value chains and the import of clean or green hydrogen, are really global sustainability standards or criteria. So you could think of a guarantees of origin concept, and the question is really, what does this entail? It should, in my mind, not only be CO2, but also the use of space, water, and the avoidance of other harmful wastes, such as nuclear waste. But with that said, I think I've given you enough of an overview, and I would stop my presentation here.